All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. And I just want to thank you for joining us this morning. The Sonoma RCD Resource Conservation District is hosting this workshop with Heather. And what we'd like to do is, if you have any questions as she's talking, go ahead and put them in the chat. They're not going to show up for everyone. They're just coming to Heather and me. What we'll do is she's going to take a break at the end of each section and go through those questions and answer your questions. So don't worry about them not getting answered right away if you put it in the chat. We're going to take about a 5-minute break every hour or so. And let me pull up my little introduction for Heather Morrison. She is a registered professional forester, a pest control advisor, and a certified botanist. She has a degree in forestry from Humboldt State University. She works predominantly in Mendocino, Sonoma, and Napa counties. Heather consults with landowners, large and small, on issues such as timber, invasive plants, restoration, fuels reduction, and CEQA compliance. She's worked for the U.S. Forest Service and CAL FIRE and now owns her own small consulting business since 2017. So we're so glad you're here today, Heather, and take it away.
All right. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I I have on each one of my slides, I tried to put down a reference to one of the fires and the year that I took the photo so that you can see it's easy to relate to maybe your property or experiences. But so you'll notice that on this one, this particular photo kind of sums up a lot of my experiences working with landowners. I've worked on a lot of different properties that were burned in different fires. And this one in particular, this is up near Anthony Peak, which is the highest point in Mendocino County. It's just right on the border of Tehama County. And it's a little tiny inholding within the Forest Service. And it was part of the Mendocino Complex fire. That was the first 1-million-acre fire. And this landowner here, he owned the property, and he was an excellent steward of the environment. And we were actually in the process of planting trees through CFIP when the fire happened. And he was told, oh, to be here in a week. It was one of those things he knew in advance, and it did eventually get there, and it did burn. And it kind of messed up the CFIP project because if you've ever been involved with CFIP, you have a plan and you have to stick to that plan. And then the fire kind of altered it because now we had all these additional areas that needed to be planted. So I've done a lot of work with landowners and worked on a lot of different fires. So I'm just trying to draw on all these experiences today when I'm talking with you, and have a lot of pictures and a lot of stuff to talk about. So the goals for today are reforestation. That's one of the sections. And so, like Patty mentioned, if you want to keep your questions about reforestation until the end, because maybe I'll cover it. So you won't need to ask it until the very end because maybe I didn't cover it. But I'm going to focus on conifers, although I do know that some of you have some interest in oak regeneration, which is really good. And I am actually going to talk a little bit about oaks versus conifer and what should be planted. I haven't really focused a lot on oak regeneration specifically, but I'm talking more about conifers, but we can touch on that a little bit as well. So I'm going to talk a lot about invasive plants because that's sort of a passion of mine. And it's really an awful thing the invasive plants after all the fires. And integrated pest management and herbicide use, which is part of integrated pest management. And best management practices specifically for roads. And the focus is really going to be on post-fire considerations, not after the fire, but about 7 to 10 years after the fire. And that's when either people have purchased properties or they're just now realizing, wow, what am I going to do here? So what I talk about could apply for some of the things, obviously, like salvage logging isn't going to be applicable, 10 years later or 7 years later, or even 3 years later, but it is, I'm going to still talk about it. So some of these things could apply right away after the fire, but they could also apply multiple years after. And so on the left there, that's Jason Wells, who is the forester at the Sonoma RCD, your tree planting. Okay, so reforestation. So this is a Kincaid fire. This is one of those trees that Jason was holding. It's a Douglas fir, and the ground is pretty well hammered on this particular site. And this was 3 years after the fire. I guess the Kincaid fire was in 2019. It was 2019. But we were able to go in and plant. So reforestation, one of the important things with reforesting an area, especially after a fire, is, what are you going to do with all of those the residual timber, right? And so this is above, Lynn, this is above your place. This is up at the foothills, and this is the Tubbs fire. 1 year we went in there and we logged. And why did we do that? Well, one of the biggest things is that we wanted to remove all this large woody material because it just is not going to, it's just not going to decompose, no matter how much you cut it up. So it reduces the fuel loading. It also reduces the falling hazards. At some point, these trees are starting to fall. They're falling on people. They're falling on roads. And then you could also, utilize the material in building products rather than wasting it and taking it to the dump, which is where a lot of this stuff ended up going anyways at the very end because the mills were too full. But also with regards to reforestation is that it's good not to have all those trees up there when you want to go in and plant, because if the trees fall, then they're crushing the baby seedlings, and so on and so forth. And also salvage logging does kind of prep the soil. One of the downsides is that you've only got about a year and a half to get the value out of the log before it starts to degrade. So okay, let me go back here. So once you're logged and you're wanting to reforest, I think the first thing, and this is one of the things that I learned on the Tubbs fire, specifically up at Foothill, the Foothills subdivision, is that do you want to replant with conifers? And you really have to sit down and think about it. And this wasn't something that I was really thinking about at the time because, I'm a forester and I'm replanting with conifer trees, and that's what we do. We plant 10 trees for every one that we harvest. I mean, that's what they said anyways. So after that experience up there were a lot of areas that were maybe not necessarily conifer forests forever, and they were actually hardwood forests. And one of the things, this is a really good slide because it talks about or it shows you what can happen to a hardwood forest over time. And you'll see this nice deciduous oak stand on the top left, and it's the establishment. And then can you guys see my mouse? Yeah. Down here, you'll see all the little tiny seedlings. And so over time, these grow up, and then at some point in time, you no longer have a hardwood forest. And how did this happen? A couple of different reasons is Douglas fir. This is the species that you see here, and it is a species, one of the dominant conifer species in Sonoma, Napa County, is that they're really prolific and they tend to seed very, very well. And prior to fire exclusion back in the early 1900s, is fires would be happening in these woodlands constantly, and the bark is very thin on these, young trees. And so when you have fire coming through, you're constantly removing Douglas fir from its invasion into these oak woodlands. Additionally, and I just recently learned this, was that ungulate grazing was also a really big thing. There was a lot more large mammals on the landscape eating, and so deer do like trees. And you probably see that if you ever go hiking, you'll see trees getting nibbled down. So by not having as many ungulates and by removing fire from the ecosystem, you'll see that what we think might necessarily have always been a conifer stand was once an oak woodland. So I think you need to really think about that. Do I want to plant oaks or do I want to plant conifers? Okay. And once you've figured that out, which you can, you can go back, and Google Earth doesn't go back that far. I think it only goes back to like the 80s, but you can also look at soil maps and see what kind of soils are there. And you can also see maybe adjacent areas and see what was, growing there and get a good idea from that. So let's just say we want to plant conifers. All right. Like I said, I'm focusing on conifers. There's a lot of challenges that I found trying to replant, and it's difficult. And so difficult for foresters, and it's difficult for forest landowners. So what are some of those challenges? Here. Here you've got on the left, that's a bunch of slash from the glass fire, and then French broom seedlings. So my perspective and for the landowner. Okay, big one. Getting the tree seedlings, not quite so easy. You can't just go to the local nursery, right? It's not like, oh, I want to buy some plants and I want to go. That's what I want to do today. Actually, I want to go down and I want to buy some plants. I don't have to be thoughtful about the seed source, how many I need. I'm just going to go and they're going to be there. Well, that just doesn't work with conifers. You need to be, we're talking thousands and thousands of trees. And you want to get the local seed source, you want to get the correct species. And so you need to be thinking in advance. So nursery availability. Okay, let me see. So that's a containerized nursery that you can see right there. You can see that they're growing a lot of trees. It takes about 14 months from start to finish to actually grow trees for a project, unless you're able to actually find somebody that has excess seedlings. And that's what I did a lot. I said, someone say, oh, I've got 5,000 extra Douglas fir seedlings I don't need. And I would buy them from that person. And then I was able to plant them right away. But at some point I wasn't able to do that. And I did have to actually find the seed. And I had to figure out how many seedlings I wanted to grow. I had at this point, I think I had like 5 or 6 different landowners, and I wasn't really quite sure the number of acres that I had. And let's say I have 200 trees per acre that I want to grow. I needed to actually obtain the seed and send that seed off to one of these nurseries. So seed is not extremely easy to obtain because there's a shortage of seed in the state. They don't want to waste it. And one of the things that was kind of interesting to me when I was buying, I think it was red fir up there in red fir up in Anthony Peak, is that they do a germination test to see how many of the seeds, because as the seeds age, they are not as fertile, right? So fewer and fewer will germinate. And so they did a germination test and it was 50% germination rate. And so I had to get twice the amount of seed that I really did need because only half of them were going to germinate. So I had to buy a lot more seed just to be able to grow my seeds. So once you've sent the seed off to the nurseries, they grow them, and then that takes about a year. Okay, so different types of seedlings. On the left, you'll see bare root, and on the right, you'll see containerized. Most of the time, we've been using containerized seedlings, and containerized are great because they are smaller and they're easier to plant. You don't have to worry about J-rooting, which is, if you look on the left, you'll see the bare roots. Look at all those roots there. And if you're putting your shovel into the ground, there's a good chance that some of those roots will get wrapped around the shovel and form what's called a J root. And then the roots are suddenly growing up instead of down, and then the seedling will die. One of the benefits of bare root is that you do have more roots, and so your root to shoot ratio is rather high, and so the trees will tend to do better versus a containerized. Although the containerized seedlings you're growing in a nursery, you can control the environment, and you can also add fertilizer into that. So most of the time we're dealing with containerized, and so those usually there was a styrofoam around. They pulled those out of styrofoam. Okay. Seed zones. Seed zones, this is a seed zone map, and seed zones are really important. And so Douglas fir that grows up in Del Norte County is going to grow a lot different than Douglas fir that grows down here in Santa Cruz County. Even though they're the same species, they have adapted to their particular environment. So the seed zones, as you can see, are trying to lump similar environmental variables together that, so the trees, for example, in 095, that would be 095 is coastal Mendocino. You can see that once it gets over the side of the coast range, you have a completely different seed zone. 096 is down there in Sonoma and Marin. And then 360, I think, is Napa. Yeah, 360 is Napa. So within each one of those seed zones, you have a 500-foot elevational difference. Because a tree that's growing at, 8,000 feet is going to be different than a tree that's growing at 5,000 feet. They have a different precipitation. The one at 8,000 feet is going to have more snow than it's going to have rain. It's also going to be used to colder temperatures and the length of growing, it's a growing season. So within each seed zone, you have the 500-foot increment change in elevation. So what happens when, you can't get seed from 096? Well, you can try to get one from an adjoining seed zone. And I was having to do that a lot because there was a lack of seed in that particular zone. I was getting seed from inland Mendocino County, which was very similar to Sonoma County. Even though it was in a different seed zone, I was able to a change in elevation is also very similar to a change in latitude. I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but as you go up or down in north or south, 1 degree change in latitude is about 100 miles, and that can change about 1 degree Fahrenheit. So you could be like a good example of that would be down here in Kern County. I remember driving there and driving to Lake Isabella. And at 8,000 feet, it was still oak woodlands. 8,000 feet up north in Placer County would have been red fir. But because I was so far south, I was still having oak woodlands at 8,000 feet. Okay, seed zone. So the next challenge, and this was another big one, was transportation. Not only when I got out into the field, but also picking those trees up. So that box right there, I think there's about 250 trees in a box, and I could fit about 3,000 trees on in my truck there. And it was hard for me. I would have had to rent a U-Haul, or I would have had to rent a truck and trailer, another trailer, and then go up and pick these trees up. I think these trees were from Etna, which is up Cal Forest Nursery. So getting the trees and then actually getting them to where you need to plant. So another issue, and Jason Wells, I'll never forget this. He had the greatest idea. Was he had wanted to actually, after the glass fire, he had wanted to get Lagunitas Brewing Company to give us free cooler space, and then they could have a beer that was called like the glass fire beer or something. And the proceeds would go towards reforesting the glass fire. And I thought that was such a really great idea, because it is so difficult to find cooler space for these trees. They do need to stay cold. And once you get them, you saw, I mean, that's only about 3,000 trees right there. What if you have 100,000 trees? Where are you going to put those? So seed storage. Unpredictable planting weather. So Patty, I was laughing when I put this slide together, because I realized why I'm still not very good on Zoom. I never stayed home during COVID. I was out in the woods working, and this was Sonoma County Tubbs fire. This is 3 years after the fire, and we had drought. I'm sure you all remember that. There was several years, and it's only been the past year or two that we've actually been getting some good rain, but during this time, it was just one day of rain in like the whole 3 months, right? So trees died. It was really difficult. So unpredictable planting weather. Planting crew availability, that's another challenge. This is the Kincaid fire and the planting crew. Trying to get crews to come down, not only come down to help, but also to try to, there's just not a lot of crews out there. There's only a few. And this particular crew, I had to kind of yank them away from other jobs that they had going on. And they had a few days here or there. So planting crew availability, they had maybe 16 guys, and I only needed like 10. But I had to take all 16. And so there's costs associated with this as well. And then what do you do when you have so many people in one small area planting? And it was just really challenging. So when you get them, making sure that you have the right number of people. This is also the Kincaid fire. That road actually is way worse than it looks. There was actually a hole in the middle of it, and the landowner had plugged it up thinking that they could hide it and it would be all right. But this is when we talk about best management practices on roads, this is not what to do. Water was coming down on this ditch here. It's insloped, and then settling here, and it was all fill, and it just completely collapsed. And so there was no way that I was going to drive my truck on it. And so we had to take the ATVs, and we had to shuttle trees. We had to shuttle a lot of trees and the crew for about a mile. So having good road access is really important, because you don't want the crews to have to do any more work than they have to. It's already pretty physically demanding. So you want the trees to be as close as possible. Planting site conditions, this is I think this is the Tubbs fire. And, it's just difficult planting. There was no site prep, or because it wasn't done right away, planting wasn't done right away. You've got this influx of grasses and lots of weedy material. One thing I would point out is I just call them the dead shade, which is this laurel, I can tell from the sprouts. But the dead shade is actually really beneficial for planting because it kind of provides a little bit of shade in an otherwise just a relentless environment in the summer. But yeah, so weedy environment, difficult planting, lots of rocks and rattlesnakes. Post-planting issues. This particular area, again, was not site prepped. So there was no effort put in to reduce the material that was existing there and prepare the site for planting. And so it has a lot of, the seedling is not going to, it's going to have a lot of competition from the grasses. And you ask why annual grasses are really very greedy when it comes to water, and they use up a lot of water in that first few inches of soil. That's really where their roots are, unlike perennial grasses. So they use up a lot of water, and the trees, these little seedlings really need that water. And when you're in drought conditions, it's just, it's usually you have pretty high mortality. Okay. Some of these things you can't control, like rocky soils, like this is up there. This is red fir, otherwise known as a silvertip, if you get a silvertip Christmas tree. So it's a poor growing environment. You've only got a few months out of the year that the trees are actually able to grow. This was another example of access. We couldn't get up there because of the snow. So we had to wait until the snow melted. And at that time, things were starting to dry out. And because it's such a rocky, kind of sandy soil, there's just no retention of water in the soil profile. And so trees can get desiccated as well. And it's hard to plant through. Animal damage. Deer do like to eat baby trees. So that's another issue. Oh, how do we overcome all of this? All right. How did I try to overcome it? I did a lot of this. I was working with a lot of foresters, trying to get seedlings and trading seedlings and picking seedlings up and working with other people like loggers. Oh, you're up in Etna. Can you pick up those trees for me? You've got a big truck, bring them down. So there was a lot of collaboration, a lot of coordination with loggers and other land managers. But as for you as a landowner, I think if you're just focused on your own property, it makes it a lot easier because you're not having to worry about, trying to make sure that everybody else is getting the trees that they need. Although it is helpful if you can kind of work with other people and go in on these projects together. But you have to take the situation into your own hands. So before I get into that, I just wanted to throw out this resource here. And it used to be called the Forest Seedling Network, and it's actually a product of the Forest Service. The Forest Service does a lot more than just manage the national forests, but they do have a lot of forest landowner programs to help people out. And this is one of them. And it can be kind of misleading because you think that it's only in the southeast United States. But if you type in the directory, you can type California in, and it will give you a number of different nurseries, including, and I've got a list of those ones on the next slide. But it's got a lot of good resources. So did everybody get that? And if they didn't, I can go back. Okay, so here's...
And Heather, let me interject for just a second. We are going to send out these slides after the fact. So if you can't get this information down, it's okay. You're going to get it in the next couple of days.
Okay.
Thanks.
So here's the California nurseries. One of the new ones that's just come around, and I have not used them, is Sierra Pacific Industries, which is a timber company that owns, I think they own about 1 million acres of land, predominantly in the Sierra Nevadas, but some up in Humboldt. And they actually went in conjunction with the state to build a nursery because there is not a lot of nurseries in the state. There's this infrastructure is not there. So they actually built a nursery. They don't have redwood there, but they do grow other seedlings. And I don't know much about them, but you can go to their website and they have like an email that you can reach out to them. But it is a public nursery because it is partially funded by the state of California. And the other public nursery up top is LA Moran, which is just right off of Interstate 80. And they are a containerized nursery. They also have a seed bank. Cal Forests, I've worked with those guys a lot. They're up in Etna, which is Siskiyou County. And then Sequoia Orchids and Redwoods is kind of a cool little spot over there in Fortuna and Ronerville. And they grow redwoods and they also grow orchids. And they're not large, but they are a great place to get redwoods. And you may be able to even purchase redwoods that they've grown. I think a lot of times they just grow trees, which is great. If you're like, hey, I need 10,000 redwoods, there you go. You can just call and ask. And the Placerville Nursery has a lot of seed as well. That's where I got my seed for the red fir. But they don't, and they also grow trees there, but I think they're bare root. Have a containerized nursery, but they don't have redwood, no redwood seed. So, okay. How many trees should I plant? So I guess you kind of have to think about this before you order your seed. How many trees should I plant? So I did a little math here. This is how I really quickly, an acre is 43,560 square feet. And it used to be that we used to plant about 300 trees an acre, and we've really reduced the number of trees because we were having such success and there would be so many trees, and then we'd have to go out and thin the trees out. And what a waste to plant the trees, to grow the trees, to plant the trees, and then to cut them down within, the first 10 years because they're too dense. So over time, we've kind of increased the spacing, which thus reduces the number of trees per acre. So the math here is on a 15-foot spacing is each tree has about a 15 by 15-foot space. It's equal to 225 square feet per seedling. And then you just put that into 43,560. It's about 200 trees an acre, roughly. One thing, the math, when you get really, really steep slopes, you will actually have an acre is a flat 209 feet by 209 feet as the crow flies. But as we know, most forest land is actually quite steep. And so you could actually physically have more than an acre. And so I've run into that problem out tree planting and running out of trees because I was planting at a 15 by 15 foot spacing, but I ran out of trees because I just had more ground. So you kind of got to be thinking about that as well. So 200 trees an acre. When we were having the drought conditions, I was putting a lot more in because I was having like 50% mortality. And so I was I was planting about twice the amount. Okay, site prep. I've been mentioning site prep, controlling weeds beforehand, and the dead shade, like I said, is super helpful. This is the glass fire, and they are treating broom there. And so this property was going to be replanted. So we're kind of prepping for that. Okay. Let's see where I'm at. Okay. So how do you overcome the challenges like picking up seedlings? All right. This is my daughter. She was helping out for the day, and Jason had rented a U-Haul, and he had driven over to Placerville Nursery and picked up all these trees. And he filled that truck up to the brim. And then we pulled the trees out and we put them on trucks and we drove them out into the woods. But this was kind of the meeting place above Santa Rosa. Okay, cold storage versus hot planting. Here, we did hot planting. We basically took the trees from the nursery, drove them down to where they needed to go, and then we tried to get them in the ground right away. But if you don't know that you're going to be planting within the week, there's so many things that have to fall into place, right? You've got to arrange your crews, and maybe the crews aren't around for that week, or maybe it's going to be a really dry spell, and you want to wait until you've got a little bit of rain. You might want to just put them in cold storage. And so, like I said, trying to arrange, making your own arrangements. Like some people have their own coolers because like that happened. My old boss he was a hunter and he had quite a large cooler, and he was able to put the seedlings in there. We didn't obviously have as many seedlings as you see in this storage facility, but there was a couple pickup trucks worth. So you can go and you can ask the local butcher, is there any room there? The little corner store down the street, he's got a cooler for the beer. I mean, is there room to put some boxes in there? Then you don't have to worry about letting the trees sit out, because really the trees need to stay between 33 to 40 degrees. And even though they're dormant, and if it's hot, they could come out of dormancy. And then they also will have really, they could desiccate rather easily. Okay. So the big day, how exciting, all this prep work put into growing the trees, and then boom, it's the day to go out there and plant. So you could do it yourself, or you could hire a crew. And I would say, unless you have a very small area, or you're super like strong and fit and are willing to put in the work, probably hiring a crew is better. And with the seedlings, you don't necessarily have to have a experienced tree planting crew, because these seedlings are a little bit more forgiving. The containerized ones are, as you saw here, Katie had, there's several in that bag, and those were all, we call them plug seedlings. And so they're pretty easy to plant. You can train people to do that. And so I've had one forester, he was training the grape guys that were working in the vineyards to go out and plant in the glass fire, because there was just nobody to do the work. But it's just difficult. This is the bags that they carry around with the trees, and then you have to go out there, plant, and then you come back and fill up the bag and just do it all day. Okay. So overcoming more challenges, seedling mortality. Here we have, it's called Vexar tubing, and this is to prevent deer browse. I personally do not use this at all. There's more cons than pros. I would say one of the biggest cons is that they do not break down. Over in Cazadero, there was some redwoods that were planted 20 years prior, and they still had the Vexar tubes around them and were severely stunted, and they were never going to come out of it because this stuff does not break down. They do have biodegradable ones, but they're more expensive. So they don't break down even to the, and the trees will basically be stuck in there. And then they're also a huge source of litter. Like there's so much Vexar tubing out there. So I tend to, if I have a deer problem, I either would overplant or I would get the biodegradable ones, but you can put these on. Another thing that some of the planting crews have done is they might just put, they'll like take a little sheet of, I don't know if it's plastic or something, but they'll kind of just lay it over the top of the tree, which eventually it'll fall off and the deer won't be able to eat it. Okay. So getting the seedlings to where they need to be. Oh, let me go back here. Those take up a lot of space too. So, if you don't have enough room, it makes it difficult when you have to add Vexar, and it also increases the cost to plant because the crews have to put those on, and then you have to get the stakes, as you can see. All right, so getting the seedlings to where they need to be. I've had to do this before. I've had tons of these boxes loaded on my quad in the front, in the back, because I couldn't drive my truck out there. And that one road I was showing you, that was one of the places that I had to do this. So You got to think about that. So when it comes to planting, you can have your Vexar tubings, or maybe you don't have your Vexar tubing, but one of the natural ways that you can kind of reduce seedling mortality is planting near a nurse plant. In this case, this is I think it's the redwood fire. Doesn't saying that. Yeah, this is the redwood complex fire that happened at the same time up in Mendocino, at the same time as the Tubbs fire. So this is above Potter Valley, and it's pretty hot and dry. And we did stalking surveys after this was planted, and the trees that had been planted next to nurse plants on like the north or east side, or next to logs or in swales, were the ones that were surviving because it was so hot and so dry out there. Additionally, having it next to the nurse plant is also a deterrent for deer. It's not going to be out there in the open and so easy to see. So just to be thoughtful about where you're planting. Okay. Okay. So monitoring, we talked about stalking surveys. Why do we do it? Because maybe we need to go out and replant. So on the left here, this is the Walbridge fire. And this was a tree that was planted in what they thought was bare ground. I'm going to keep reiterating this, is that you can never, ever have bare ground. You might look terrible after a fire, but there is so much stuff that's going to grow back. And here they planted in what they thought was bare ground, and it wasn't. It was full of horseweed. This is Erigeron bonariensis, which is actually really, really bad in this particular spot. And so we did some monitoring, saw that there was one tree survived out of like 200 that they had planted. So it obviously needed to be replanted. But before you go replant, you needed to deal with the weeds. So we do the stalking surveys post-planting just to see, do we need to go out there again, or do we need to fill in some holes? Maybe an acre didn't make it, but everywhere else was fine. And then what do I need to do to change that? So in this case, it would have been to deal with the weeds. And the whole goal is to have success. So this is let's see. Yeah, this tree is a 2-year-old seedling, still alive. There was a lot of mortality after planting, because this was the year that we had so many dry winters, but this tree made it. So that's really the goal, is to have trees put back in, growing again. Let's see. Okay. So I think that is the end of my reforestation talk. So I guess I'm ready for questions. Is Patty there? I see her.
Yes, ma'am, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. You have your RCD logo.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm done with reforestation. Does anybody have any questions?
Are there any questions? I see one from Lynn. Do you see that?
No.
Click chat down at the bottom of your screen. Do you
Oh.
have that?
I got it on the top.
Okay.
Show chat. Oh. No, I don't see it now. Kind of that went away.
Okay, well, I'll just tell you. It says we've introduced cattle grazing. What is the best method for protecting seedlings from cattle?
Oh. Yeah, trampling is another. I just had put deer browse in there, but trampling is also, and getting eaten by the cows. Oh, boy. I would imagine that the Vexar, like if you did the biodegradable, would be great, but I don't know if the cattle are going to notice that, and they might just do, if you've got a lot of cattle, I think in that case, you'd have to really try to focus on moving the cattle around so that they're not wanting to eat all of their grass, and just moving the cattle often so that they're not getting bored and wanting to eat the trees, or they're just not in the pen long enough to damage the trees. But you will have damage unless you would you want to put like a larger type fence around, that would be the only thing I could think. But cattle exclusion, that would be what I would recommend, or just not keeping them there very long.
Okay,
So,
the next question is, what about watering seedlings?
okay, great one. That's a great one. So this is why we try to plant trees that are adapted to the environment, and we try to do it in the winter so that they can take advantage of that wet weather, and we do not water. I have had landowners going out and doing the watering when we had invested a lot of time and money in the Tubbs fire. We were putting redwood, because redwood is not super common above Santa Rosa, but there are redwood growing in some of the drainage areas in certain spots, and so they were putting a little bit of effort. They had the ability to go ahead and water, but generally, no, you don't want to do that. You want Mother Nature to just to take care of herself. And by putting the right tree on the ground and not planting non-native species, we always want to plant what was growing there before, kind of thing, and then hopefully you won't have to water. So I hope that you don't have to water, but if you did, it's not going to kill the tree, but it's just not really practical on a large scale.
Great. If we're looking at an area that was once a hardwood forest, but then was encroached by firs, rather than do active planting, we're thinking that passive reforestation by the remaining firs would be adequate. Your thoughts?
Okay, that's a good question. So what's really wonderful is that the Board of Forestry has finally realized that this is a problem, this conifer encroachment into oak woodlands. And we do have an exception to the forest practice rules that you can go and log in these forests that are dominated by deciduous hardwood trees. So that is an option if you wanted to remove the Douglas fir. You really need to remove the Douglas fir, because even one tree remaining is going to continue to seed in and produce all of these baby trees. So if you can remove those trees, that's great. If you can't, prior to, you can still go ahead and plant your oaks, but you just want to make sure that you're not having any more Douglas fir input into the system, because then you are going to constantly be battling all of these seedlings that are going to outcompete the oaks. So if you're not able to log, and it's not always really an option for a lot of people, or the trees are too small, but you can also do girdling. Girdling is a really great way of killing the tree. The tree still stands there, but it's no longer competing with the oaks, and it'll just be a big snag, and then eventually it will fall down. But I would say that the planting amongst them is a great idea. And with acorns, I've been on some acorn planting projects or oak planting projects, and it's really best to try to just do direct acorn planting and putting like 3 in a hole, versus like digging a hole and then putting 3 acorns in there, versus trying to do seedlings. Oak seedlings have such a long taproot. It's really difficult. It's not like a conifer seedling where you saw that the root systems are so short. They just chop them off with a paper cutter, but you can't do that with the taproot of an oak tree. So I would definitely collect the oaks from the year before, like acorns from the year before, and then replant.
Thank you. Before I do the next question, Craig, is it possible for you to put your question in the chat, please? Okay, you mentioned looking at soil information to know if the restoration goal should be for a hardwood or conifer forest. Mm-hmm. Can you say more about what soils correspond to the 2 forest types?
Good one. All right. So I I know up in Mendocino County the types of soils that you'll see, um, the Van Dam and the Boomer soils. Not as familiar with the soil types down in Sonoma County, but you can get on the NRCS website, and I wish that I had put this up on one of my screenshots, but they have it's called a web soil survey, and they will give you a you can put your property, you can find your property on the map, and they will actually send you a report specifically for your property and talk about each particular soil type that's there and then what its best and highest use is for. So some of these drier sites, Sonoma County is so interesting because there is such a wide range of habitats. I've seen redwoods growing right near chamise, which is super weird. Chamise is a is a chaparral, and then the soil type was conducive for chaparral at that point, but then right nearby it was deep enough for redwood. So I would say going to the NRCS, the website, the web soil survey, putting in your property, and then getting your report, and then just reading the report. And it will be really helpful in telling you what that particular soil is best used for. It'll say, oh, for timber production. If it says timber production, that means that, oh, that's a conifer soil. I mean, you can also go out and look at the soils themselves. If they're really deep north, like some of these, like Lynn above your property there, I mean, that was a definite conifer forest. Looking at the deep soils and what was there, but on the south slopes, you got to look at the aspect. So aspect soil, north slopes, you're going to be tending to have more of the conifers, and the south slopes, you're going to be tending to have more of the oaks and on the ridge tops. So I hope that was helpful. And if you have access to like GIS, they've got free soil layers that you can download and look at, and you might even be able to do that online.
Great. Okay. Are there guidelines for girdled trees such as Doug fir, spacing and density?
Okay, so can I ask, I'm trying to understand the spacing and density. I'm just going to assume, do you want to girdle all the trees? I would say girdle all the Douglas firs if it was an oak woodland. If they're too large. If they're small, you can you can just cut them down with a chainsaw and then deal with the slash. But when the trees get to be too large, in some cases the trees are so large, they were in that that one slide that I had. Let's see if I can do this. I got time. Okay. You can see on this, so on the top two, obviously the piercing stage, you can just take those out with the chainsaw. But as they start getting larger, like on the bottom left and definitely on the right, at that point, you're going to need to start falling the trees. But when they're piercing or when they're overtopping, a lot of times, like those are black oaks, they can actually do damage when they fall, the black oaks. And so at that point, when I've been working with the NRCS on some of these projects, they just recommended girdling those trees so that they would just kind of fall apart, become snags, and then eventually kind of just break down and not damage the oak as much as if they had fallen the tree. So girdling, I would say girdle all of the trees. And maybe that wasn't the question, maybe you're wanting to know how to girdle the trees. With Douglas fir, you girdle it with a chainsaw, and you need to do actually you need to cut it twice, two separate bands, because they are so fast growing that they can grow right through the first girdle. So actually creating a pretty big wound that goes through the cambium to the wood, and then that cuts off the circulation of water. But you need to do that in two separate spots, right around DBH, which is diameter breast height, 4.5 feet above the ground. So I don't know if that answered the question. Maybe they can ask again.
Hey, do you have experience planting redbud?
I have a redbud I planted in my yard. It's not budded out, so maybe I didn't do a good job because they are budding out in Lake County, I see now. As far as like mass production, no. No. But I do know that there are nurseries, and one of the great things that nursery list that I gave you has a lot of native plant nurseries that are available, and probably something small like that. Yeah, they would probably be containerized. So, but I'm sorry, I don't really have a lot of experience with that.
Those are all the questions we have. Does anybody have anything else? If you want to put it in the chat, we'll give you another second here.
A good time for a break, Patty? It's
I
almost
think
been an
it's a good
hour.
time for a break. Yes, let's take
Okay.
5 minutes. We'll be back at 10:07.